Bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs. Je m'appelle Christian Arnsperger. Je suis professeur à l'Université de Lausanne en durabilité, anthropologie économique. J'ai le plaisir de vous souhaiter la bienvenue au nom de l'Université de Lausanne, de sa direction et du vice-rectorat durabilité et campus, ainsi que de la professeure Nouria Hernandez, future rectrice, à cette soirée de réflexion et de débat en compagnie du professeur Paul Ehrlich. Nous exprimons notre reconnaissance à mesdames Yvonne Barlac et Margaret Bergen de Pan Suisse qui ont rendu possible la présence de M. Ehrlich ce soir et qui nous offrent gracieusement la traduction simultanée. I'd like to very warmly welcome Professor Ehrlich and his wife Anne, his co-author from the very beginning, to the University of Lausanne. A zoologist and entomologist by training, Paul Ehrlich earned his MA and his PhD from the University of Kansas before joining the faculty at Stanford in 1959 and becoming professor of biology there in 1966. In 1968, he and his wife wrote a book about population growth and resource depletion that went pretty much unnoticed. They've been busy ever since writing many more articles and books to try to make up for that, and I believe he's here tonight to tell us more about that. Since 1977, Paul Ehrlich is the Bing Professor of Population Studies at the Department of Biological Sciences at Stanford University. In 1984, he founded Stanford University's Center for Conservation Biology, which conducts interdisciplinary research to build a sound basis for the conservation, management, and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystem services, to evaluate factors that are leading to declining environmental security and increasing inequity, and to find practical solutions to that predicament. A center where our Lausanne colleague Antoine Guizan, a world-renowned authority on biodiversity, spent some time studying and researching. In 2010, Professor Ehrlich co-founded the Millennium Assessment of Human Behavior, MAHB, a network initiative analogous to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, but focusing on human behavior and collective actions leading to global collapse, and also asking how behavioral, cultural, and institutional change towards a sustainable path can be accomplished. It was recently renamed the Millennium Alliance for Humanity and the Biosphere. The list of academic honors Paul Ehrlich has received over the past 5 decades has grown almost ridiculously large, showing, by the way, that large numbers and sustained growth aren't all bad. Let me just mention that he is, among many other things, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and an honorary member of the British Ecological Society. Professor Ehrlich has received, among numerous other prestigious honors, the Blue Planet Prize, the Eminent Ecologist Award of the Ecological Society of America, as well as the Crayford Prize in Population Biology and the Conservation of Biological Diversity, which is explicitly recognized as the equivalent of a Nobel Prize in areas of science where no Nobel is attributed. Professor Ehrlich, you've come to the Swiss University where the human and social issues linked to sustainable development and to the long-term prospects of our planet are being given the most scrutiny and are being most closely woven into the university's priorities, its teaching curricula, and its research agendas. Accordingly, debates here are particularly lively around what sustainability means, how substitutable natural and technological capital really are, and whether growth, economic growth, urban growth, population growth, consumption growth, material flow growth, is compatible with a finite biosphere. We have students doing permaculture on campus and wanting to create a low-tech eco-village. We have researchers working on industrial ecology and high-tech carbon capture. We have a group on environmental humanities working on degrowth, alternative agriculture, and economic relocalization. And we are close geographical neighbors to one of the most technophile engineering schools in the country. So we welcome intellectual controversy and the diversity of scientific viewpoints. And we should welcome any scientist who earnestly and honestly raises difficult and even disturbing questions about how the world works, about how we human beings inhabit our planet, and about what could and should be done to make the Earth a better, more just, and more hospitable place to be born into. Professor Ehrlich, your name in German means earnest and honest. Regardless of whether, after seriously, honestly, and earnestly listening to you, one ends up agreeing or disagreeing with your views on the highly complex and subtle interactions between economic growth, overconsumption of resources and goods, and population dynamics, your impressive list of publications and ongoing public engagements attests to how earnest and honest you are and always have been about your role both as a scientist and as an intellectual. We're eagerly anticipating your current thoughts on the nexus between population, ethics, and the environment. And after your talk, we'll organize a brief roundtable and then a question and answer period with the members of our audience. Professor Ehrlich, thank you so much for your visit tonight. The floor is yours.
Am I on? Am I on? Can you hear me? Merci mille fois, Professor Arnsperger. Blessedly for you, that's the last French I will use, because outside of j'entre dans la salle de classe, je regarde autour de moi, and so on, it's long gone. But that was a wonderful introduction, and I'm going to try and throw out, I don't think the ideas will be so controversial here. It's a great pleasure to be hosted by the University of Lausanne, and it's a great pleasure to be sponsored by the most important think tank in the world, Pan Swiss. Many of you know of it, but for example, they just have now a large group of people from the social and the natural sciences looking at all the interconnections that are largely ignored in public discourse on the topics that Professor Arnsperger just talked about, and recognize fully the need to bring the social sciences, the general public, and the natural sciences together to deal with what we often speak of as the human predicament, and particularly focusing on the interconnections and on things that might be done to soften the collapse that's coming, and maybe even to make it easier to recover from the collapse. This is, by the way, the second conference that I've been on this topic in the last 2 weeks. There's a growing movement in the scientific community and in the knowledgeable social science community to realize that we've gone so far now that the chances of actually keeping the kind of society we have today going are shrinking to the point where we should be thinking about other issues. Now, my leader here said that I've got to restrict myself to 1 hour and 40 minutes. That was the number we came up with. So I'm going to set the bezel on my watch so that I don't run over. And I'm going to open the bottle of gin because my voice is very weak. And I need to keep it oiled. But anyway, why have Anne and I focused so much on population over time? The reasons are complex in one sense and simple in another sense. The issue, of course, penetrates every area of human endeavor, and there's a huge amount of detail in it, but the basic point is that, has been known by the scientific community for a long time, that the health of our life support systems is mostly attacked by and depends on the level of aggregate consumption that human beings occupy. Not just on the level of aggregate consumption, but also on the technologies that we choose to employ for that consumption. Though, for example, years ago, some of us developed, Ann and I particularly, and John Holdren, what's called the IPAT equation, which simply says that the impact of a population on its life support systems is a product of three different things: the size of the population, the per capita consumption. It's IPAT because it's easier to say affluence and then have an IPAT equation than to say consumption and have an IPICAT equation. But affluence in this case is just measured as per capita consumption, usually measured by energy units. And then the technologies that are used to support that affluence. And for example, the T factor is much smaller if you walk to work than if you drive in a Hummer. It's not a very complex issue. It's often, by the way, largely misunderstood. The reason we developed it was that around 1950s and 60s, the idea was there was a horrendous population problem in the world, and the problem was too many Indians, too many Mexicans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it totally ignored the per capita consumption portion of the impact. So the idea was you want to get the Indians to stop reproducing, even though it would have been much smarter to get the Swiss to stop reproducing, because the Swiss are big consumers, and at that time particularly, the Indians weren't. Now I know this is a sophisticated audience. By the way, I guess there's no way the translator can tell me if I'm going too fast. Is she following me, or can anybody tell from the translation? I'm going to try and go a little slower. Let me focus not on things I think all of you know or are familiar with, but make some points that, at least in the US, many educated, in quotes, audiences don't understand. To take a prime example, what is the major environmental threat from the point of view of the average educated American? Today, it's sea level rise. Climate change is a big thing, but the way they look at climate change is we're going to raise the seas. Now that is, unless the laws of physics are repealed, the seas are going to rise. There's no question about that. I think, by the way, you can relax. If it happens here, we'll all manage to outwalk it, but you're not in much danger at the moment here in Lausanne from sea level rise. But the point is, of course, that threatens hundreds of millions of people with great inconvenience and so on. It's trivial compared to the climate change that changes patterns of precipitation over the planet, because patterns of precipitation are what give you your agriculture. And our agriculture is A, totally tied to patterns of precipitation. B, there's no preparation being made to make our ag infrastructure, particularly what moves water around, flexible enough to deal with what's going to coming. As the climate scientists have told us, with no possibility of being wrong, we've already gotten ourselves into a situation where there's going to be continuous climate change over at least the next 1,000 years, which means you can't think of climate change and agriculture as we're in good shape now, the change will come, but it will be good shape somewhere else and we'll easily transition to it. And we'll go to a different pattern, but that pattern will be wonderful. The pattern's going to be changing continuously. And if the current evidence looks right, it's going to be changing faster and faster continuously. Now, this is in a world where you have to realize, by the way, Ann and I were enormously criticized at the time of the population bomb for saying the battle to feed all of humanity is over. Within the last 6 months, the New York Times has basically said, this is crazy, there's no population problem, even though when we wrote the book, there were 3.5 billion people on the planet, 3.5 billion. Today, there are 7.5 billion, but of those, roughly 800 million are undernourished, and roughly 2 billion have such a miserable diet, that is in terms of micronutrients and so on, they can't function properly. So you have somewhere between 2 and 3 billion people not being properly fed, and the New York Times looks with great relaxation at the prospect that we will add another 3 or 4 billion people to the planet by the end of this century. That is, add roughly twice as many people to the planet before the end of this century as were on the planet when I was born. When I was born in 1932, there were 2 billion people. It's a pure miracle that I happened to be the 2 billionth human being. I mean, I didn't even realize it at the time. But so the interaction between the numbers of people, the amount of consumption, and climate change is very clear. What isn't clear to the New York Times or most other people is what an engine of climate change agriculture is. The more people you have, the more agriculture you have to have. Right now, and it depends a lot on how you do the numbers, the food system donates about 1/3 of the greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, which of course is what's speeding up the change in the climate, which of course is threatening agriculture itself. It's a typical example of the interactions between these various factors. Right here in the Rhone Valley, we have an example of something that's tied very tightly into that. Something that Pan Swiss is very much concerned with is we're trying to toxify the entire Rhone Valley by spraying pesticides on the grape fields from helicopters. And that's basically nuts. We already have unrecognized a global toxics problem. If we ran your blood in a laboratory, the results would read like the shelf list from an organic chemistry lab, and a lot of the compounds that you found would be very serious, have serious effects on you. If you're a kid, even more serious effects, because many of them mimic the action of hormones that do all sorts of neat things for us or bad things for us, depending on what we do. So we see we've got population size. That tells you what you have to do in agriculture. You do it in agriculture, it changes the climate, because that's one of the things agriculture does. That threatens the agricultural system. One of the things we try to do in our Mickey Mouse industrialized agriculture, anybody who's looked closely at it knows that we could be doing the same thing and getting the same productivity without doing all the insane things that we're now doing. You think about all these toxic chemicals going around, and then you realize that many of them are worse if the planet gets warmer, because they get volatilized, they move around more, and so on. So that's tied in. Then you think about the social sciences. Why do we do these nutty things? Well, of course, I hate to say this in front of my boss here, but we have what's very widely recognized as a faith-based economic system. And a faith-based economic system is, in a sense, the very background of the whole problem. What are the articles of faith? One is that the gin will help with my voice. First is that you can grow continuously on a finite planet, and that every economic problem that there is basically got to be, if you have unemployment, you got to solve it with more growth. It's sort of like the European insanity, we call it, where people think that there's a huge problem with the aging of the population, and if we don't get more immigrants or so on and so forth, a thing that's known to be spherically senseless. In other words, it's idiotic from any point of view, but that's how the demographers and the economists, not all the economists, tend to interact. So one thing is you can grow forever, even though we know that's absolutely wrong. And another major thing, by the way, I have to say, many good economists have countered this and tried to persuade other economists to change their ways, that human beings make rational decisions. Even though the neurobiologists have shown without any question, you can't make any decisions at all if you're not involving emotion in them. And emotions are absolutely tied in to decision making. Now again, some of the best work showing that that's correct. It's been done by economists, but one of the things is that the economists that the politicians listen to work for funny books, what do you call them here? Comic books, like the Wall Street Journal. Ever heard of the Wall Street Journal? I'm sure you've got the equivalent in French or German. But we have a world that's run by a very, very powerful and clever group of basically industrialists, the neocons and so on, that have managed to infiltrate the media. They've infiltrated the schools, and they are basing our entire society and the future of the society on the idea that the critical thing for people, for human beings, is to make GDP grow. And that is, in a sense, behind almost everything that's wrong. If you ask a social scientist in the United States who looks at the state of the world and is asked, what is the most important thing you could possibly do to give us a chance of avoiding a collapse? Every single one of them, I think, would say, get the money out of politics. In other words, as long as corporations are treated as individuals, as long as they buy the politicians, and we have the best politicians money can buy in the United States, you're not going to correct a lot of these problems. But a crucial thing then is, almost all our problems are tied together and almost inseparably. For example, talk about agriculture. You've probably heard of the problem of the disappearance of biodiversity. In the last 40 years, roughly, about half of all wildlife have disappeared from the planet. But it isn't the pandas and the elephants you really have to worry about. It's the pollinators, for example, who are going down the drain in North America at a rapid rate. They have an economic value of about $18 billion a year, but that's not the important thing. They have huge value to giving us a diversified diet and be healthy. More important than that, that's never mentioned, is the biodiversity that's being wiped out in the form of natural enemies of crop pests. And that's going in a very rapid direction, just like we're losing the bats that are so crucial to keeping pests off of our crops and to getting the vectors of the viruses that are spreading and becoming more common in the US and so on. So biodiversity is tied into it all. You'll never hear any value being put on biodiversity in the dominant economic paradigm in the United States. You never stop building malls or suburbs. I was just in Hawaii, in an area where I had loved 40 years ago, and it's now absolutely solid development and building more. If you go to China, you can see the same thing. How many of you have been to China and seen the high-rise, one after another, high-rise building designed to take the urbanizing Chinese population and house them? And if you look closely, I mean, you go into some of these cities, there'll be 30 or 40 visible towers that are being built, and all with low-ceiling apartments and all air-conditioned. And then you open the window of your car and you almost choke to death because the coal that's being burned to generate the electricity to do the air conditioning is horrendous. They're going to have to stop doing that. They know they're going to have to stop doing that, but they're so badly organized, like most societies, they can't bring themselves either to make the buildings cross-ventilatable so you could possibly live in them without air conditioning. And if you look closely, as Anne did, there are no facilities around these things. You stick these people in these buildings and there are no shops, there are no common ground of any kind. And as a result, most of them are empty. And so I could go on down the list of how these things interact, but hopefully you all know it. There is no place in this entire mess where economists, ecologists, social scientists, everyday people, businessmen, shouldn't be talking about these things, interacting about these things, saying, how in hell can we possibly prevent a collapse with the system going in the direction that it's going? And this, I want to make sure, this raises a whole series of questions about how we organize our society, about governance and so on. For instance, sounds to me like this university is doing very well in the right direction. I happen to work at the best university in the world, Stanford University in California. They haven't done a damn thing. In other words, everybody that I know in the social sciences, in the natural sciences, and just friends realize we're in deep trouble. We have an existential problem in our society. It's not working right. It's maybe more dramatic in the US today than it would be in Switzerland today because of our presidential nonsense. But, well, I have to tell you that it's been useful scientifically. When you get into the areas of toxicology, one thing is very clear, and that is if you raise a child upwind from the lead smelter, they're smarter than if they're raised when they were born and raised downwind of the lead smelter. If you raise a child that was born upwind of the pesticide spraying like you have down the Rhone Valley here, they have more IQ points than if they were raised downwind of it. Now, we also know that the toxic substances have been spread globally very thoroughly. Some of the most affected animals or people are actually in the Arctic and subarctic because of the way wind patterns go. So there is a school of thought, which I actually have been on the edge over, that one of our biggest problems is that we're dumbing down humanity because everybody's now being exposed to these toxic chemicals at much higher levels than anybody would recommend. I thought that was just theory, but I've now seen solid empirical proof. Have any of you watched a Republican debate in the United States? I mean, so we have, you guys don't even vote. I mean, come on over. So, governance problems. The state system that we've developed is about 200 years old. If there's one thing that's crystal clear, it is dysfunctional now. It cannot deal with the global problems of nuclear weapons, the epidemiological problems, the climate problems, and so on. We can't even get an international discussion going on what we ought to do about this dysfunctional system. We have the same thing in the United States, but we know why we can't do it. In 1770s and 80s, we got rid of the British yoke, and we had the Declaration of Independence, and then we had to have a constitution. And a bunch of elderly white men got together with all the same education and produced a document that most people think was the, in a sense, critical political document of an entire era at the time. The US Constitution is something that, in a sense, we could be very proud of if we'd been involved in it, because it has worked reasonably well and has been copied around the world. Unfortunately, we can't change it. I was part of a group at the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in the 1970s that was charged with finding what was wrong with the Constitution in terms of what we were going to need in the next century and to recommend revisions. And I thought we had some pretty good ideas, mostly not mine. Mostly we had the guy who ran it was part of President Roosevelt's Brains Trust. He was quite old by that time, but they were really good people who thought hard about these things. And they decided, not me particularly, maybe because I joined the group, to dissolve it. Why did they decide to dissolve it? Because the Constitution, if you're going to make major changes in it, not just one change here or there, you have to have a constitutional convention. If you had a constitutional convention then in the United States or today in the United States, it wouldn't deal with how you fix the problems of governance, things that are how the executive relates to the legislative and this sort of thing. It would be on gun control, abortion, gay rights, and so on. And so they know that having a constitutional convention would be a disaster. In a way, we're locked into a system which, if you've watched US politics, you know has become really non-functional. There has not been, in a Republican debate and barely in a Democratic one mention of an important problem. Republicans haven't said a thing about any important problem. To them, an important problem is, can gays get married? That to them is an earth-shaking issue. Now, I'm often asked about that, by the way, and I have to say, I'll give you my views. I think, yes, gays should get married. Why should us straights be the only ones who suffer? I mean, you got to take a broad view, scale view of these things. All right, so we have not been able to solve the problems. within our society. And I have to say that, in my view, neither the natural scientists nor the social scientists are doing a very good job. To give you an example, probably of a discipline that's represented here, of one I think does a miserable job, is political science. And for example, one of the premier journals in political science in the US is Foreign Affairs. Any of you ever look at it? I can't see the audience, doesn't matter. Actually, I'm doing something wrong. I was supposed to stand up here, not back there. So I'm back in the light. Foreign Affairs has not had a sensible article that I've ever seen on environmental issues. If you think about it for a moment, there is absolutely no major issue in international affairs that doesn't have a gigantic environmental component to it, and yet they remain entirely ignorant of it. Similarly, and I hate to say it, until very recently, most economists had no training whatsoever in the natural sciences. The famous article by Collender and Clammer about 1980, 85, actually listed what the training of the average economist was. Nothing that would ever destroy their idea that they can grow forever. I looked through about 5 to 10 years of the Journal of Economic Perspectives, which is the top economics journal in the United States. I can tell you 2 stories about it. First of all, looking all the way through it, you could come up with a list of terms related to the environment, to equity, to women's rights, to all sorts of things, never appear in the journal. They actually had their own analysis. The article, the story I like best about them, though, is a group I've been for 30 years a member of the Bayer Institute of Ecological Economics. And we wrote an article with the title, Are We Consuming Too Much? That's like, I don't know, it's real heresy. But by pure alphabetic imagination, about 16 of us, Ken Arrow, the top economist in the world, Nobel laureate and so on, was the first author. And we got it accepted and published. But we heard from through one person, what one of the editors had said. Well, we've got to publish this article by Ken Arrow and his communist friends. And so I'm going to have my stationery one of these days with Paul Ehrlich, communist friend of Ken Arrow. All right. Now, as my time is not running short, I could rave on a lot of other things, but I'd like to talk a little bit about ethics, because I think one of the things that's missing from the entire conversation is the ethical implications, A, of what we do today and what we are likely to do in the future, and how the growing amount of consumption, the growing amount of population, and so on, are likely to affect ethical issues. Here I can say something nice about the economists, and that is they're the only group I know of that have really looked seriously at intergenerational ethics. You know, what it means today. Can you, for instance, do anything about the externalities you're creating today, evaluate their impact on future generations, and so on. There are huge numbers of things that we don't discuss in the United States that I think have gigantic ethical implications. For instance, although in many ways I'm supportive of Barack Obama, I think his use of drones and blowing up wedding parties and so on is absolutely off the wall unethical, and an awful lot of people in our military agree with that. Just like the Bush administration using torture on suspects for terrorism, I'm happy to say that's been stopped, apparently. And interestingly, again, the head of our CIA just said even if he was ordered to do it, he wouldn't do it again. So there is some discussion of ethical issues, but not, for example, of why the Soviets, Freudian slip for somebody my age, why the Russians need 7,000 nuclear weapons aimed at us, and we need 7,000 nuclear weapons aimed at them. Years ago, John Holdren and I did a back-of-the-envelope calculation about, this is a time when there were about 15,000 nuclear weapons on both sides, on how many atomic bombs of the Hiroshima size, firecrackers, by today's standards, would be required to end the United States or Russia as functioning entities. Anybody like to guess? One might actually do it. As a matter of fact, Bill Perry, who's involved, by the way, we're working into this program that the Pan-Swiss is supporting, the whole nuclear issue, and Bill was Clinton's Secretary of War and has been Secretary of Defense. We changed the name. When I was a kid, when I was born, we had a Secretary of War, but now we have a Secretary of Defense, even though we have the biggest military establishment in the world, far beyond anybody else. But, can't remember, how many? You get rid of, and it ties in with the food system. We calculated that 12 Hiroshima-sized bombs would end the United States, because all you have to do is take out Washington and New York, so the financial system and the government's gone, and then you take out the rail centers. And if you can't move food around the United States, everybody starves. In other words, most people, if you ask on Stanford campus, the average faculty member or student, where does your food come from? The best they can normally do is a supermarket. They have no idea that transportation systems are utterly part of the food system, and if you screw up the transportation system, everybody starves quite quickly. Interestingly, Russia, we only needed to have 9 for them, because it turns out they're more concentrated. There are more nodes that you can hit and take out and destroy their society. As long as I mentioned, there's obvious connections between population, climate change, and nuclear war. Climate change, for instance, was a huge impact on the whole Syrian mess. But India and Pakistan hate each other to begin with. There are a whole bunch of people in both countries would love to have a nuclear war. A lot of people think the Mumbai terrorism action was designed to try and generate a nuclear war between India and Pakistan. They're dependent on water, both countries, coming from the Himalayan water tower, the ice and snow of the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau, and they're disappearing, and that would be a real cause for a war. And the most recent work by Toon and al. Say that a nuclear war with using about 200 weapons between India and Pakistan would end Switzerland as a functioning entity. So it's out there, but I bet it's never mentioned in a Swiss newspaper. It sure as hell isn't mentioned in an American newspaper. Because the people who want to keep things going the way they are now, the people in the United States, for example, who are very highly paid to revise our triad system of nuclear defense, would lose their jobs. You know, a lot of people make money on this stuff. You never want to turn your back on where the money is if you want to know what's going on in these situations. Similarly, I just mentioned this, for it's so old in the biological literature, but people don't recognize it. Chances of large epidemics go up very nicely with population size. In fact, there's some diseases won't even last in human beings if you don't have gigantic populations. Measles, to give a simple example, you probably need something on the order of a city with 200,000 or 300,000 people before measles will remain in a US population. Otherwise, everybody either dies or gets sick and immune before that, and then the disease dies out. All right, so I won't talk about the ethics of blowing up wedding parties or having so many nuclear weapons that you can actually kill everybody virtually in both countries or all countries if you wish to. But what are some of the things that are coming along now that are ethical issues not widely recognized as such? Directly in the population area, of course, is what is an ethical population size? Can you ethically have, say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children? That's an interesting debate that ought to be had. I think most educated people in the US now that understand that 2 should be the maximum size in a family. Not clear that's true. It probably ought to be 1, because the problem with solving the population problem, as opposed to the, I got time, as opposed to the consumption problem, is that do it humanely. Changing the population size takes a very, very long time. The famous Fred Pierce fallacy is that our problem isn't too many people, it's too much consumption. That's like saying the problem with the area in that triangle is that the width is too large, not the length. And of course, there's no way you can separate those two things out, but you can say something about the speed with which you can change the width of a certain rectangle or the length. Now, we know you could dramatically transform patterns of consumption in a very short time. In 1941, December, the US had produced almost 4 million passenger cars. After December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day, we stopped doing that. And instead, we produced hundreds of thousands of military aircraft, hundreds of thousands of tanks, millions of machine guns and rifles. We designed and deployed nuclear weapons. We rationed a whole series of things, including beef. But I can never forget when I was a kid, around 1943, my grandparents came for dinner, and my mother produced this beautiful standing rib roast. I hope that translates into French. Anyway, a rare standing rib roast. And my grandfather said, "Wow, you must have used a lot of points, the red points, to get that." And my father said, who was a joker, he said, "Nah." He says, "We got it at Whirlaway." Now, that won't mean a thing to you, but when beef became rationed, they opened a whole series of horse meat markets, and they named it after the latest winner of the Triple Crown, who was named Whirlaway. So the implication, of course, was that this beautiful roast was horse meat. And neither of my grandparents would touch it. My mother couldn't convince them it was really beef, and I got to eat most of it, so it was wonderful. But we also rationed gasoline, rubber, various metals, and so on. We had 400,000 or so people killed. That was in a 4-year period, and then we converted again at the end, and in a very short time, we were making television sets instead of armored cars and military aircraft, and so on. So we know, and that, by the way, something very similar happened in all the other major contenders in the Second World War. Britain changed its economy entirely, Japan did, Germany, and so on and so forth. So we know you can do that. If you got the right incentive, you can do that very fast. But the only way to humanely change the population size is to work on the total fertility rate and get it down. And that takes a lot of time. And the ways to do it sound simple, but are close to impossible because we've tried hard at it. First thing, give women everywhere equal rights, opportunities, education with men. Doesn't happen in any country in the world at the moment. So that's a huge challenge, but you know if you do that, the total fertility rate comes down. Give every sexually active human being full access to modern contraception and backup abortion. Another obvious thing, but a big problem. We do not know if women had absolutely equal rights and everybody had access to contraception and abortion, whether the total fertility rate would go well below 2, which is where it has to be if you're going to shrink the size of the population. There are a lot of work has been done on estimating carrying capacity, how many people you can survive on the planet, be maintained, be sustained, if you want to use the common term. Almost all, Partha Dasgupta just finished up such a thing and came out with a very interesting number close to ours, but it's 2 or 3 billion is the maximum. We're already at 7.4 and going up. And so you really need to get the total fertility rate well down. It doesn't mean there won't be problems of age composition and so on, but nothing like the problems of trying to support a planet where you're just using your capital continuously. And the capital drainage is becoming very obvious. If you look at numbers like the energy return on energy investment and so on, you find out we're going in the wrong direction. Okay, I'll just mention 2 other areas of ethics, and then we can talk about them in the discussion. One is the more we learn about other organisms, the more we realize that people are in no way extinct and that other organisms can suffer and so on, which adds a big dimension to the issues of animal rights and so on. And particularly because we are now moving to a more and more meaty diet, which is exactly the opposite of what we're doing, those issues are going to become bigger and bigger and bigger. Some people are already thinking, by the way, about the rights of cyborgs and robots and computers. So that's a crazy area, but it's getting to be a big area. And more important from my personal point of view is Jim Hansen and others, but Jim has been one of the leaders on it, talking about scientific reticence. That is, the reticence of when Jim said 1.5 degrees Celsius may not be safe, that may be dangerous. Scientists on an editorial board said you can't use a word like dangerous. It's too much of an opinion, and so on. This is plain nuts, and I think that kind of behavior highly unethical. You don't say, if a doctor says to you, if you smoke 3 packs a day for your entire life, that's dangerous, that's perfectly okay. But when somebody talking about the health of the entire system that supports everybody says something is dangerous, that's using the wrong word. And obviously, you do have to communicate with the general public. I believe that's my hour and 40 minutes, and so I will be happy to turn it back to my colleague and one of my very few friends among economists. Pleasure.
So,
you want me to sit? Yeah. You want me at this one? Yeah, thanks.
okay. Is this working? Okay, thank you. Right, so thank you, Professor Ehrlich, for this entertaining and diverse lecture. We are going to be having a short roundtable just maybe to launch the debate with some questions from here. I'm presenting to you first my colleague Eric Verrecchia, who is a soil scientist from the Faculty of Geoscience here at the University of Lausanne, who will maybe ask, if he's okay with that, the first questions. Then Professor Guido Palazzo from the Economics Faculty, HEC Lausanne, and working in business ethics. And I'll probably just moderate, because then we would also like to have some room for your questions and interventions. We'll see. We'll see how long it can go. Are you ready for about 4 or 5 hours of discussion? Is that okay?
6, I think, because we got to get some of the detail
okay.
in.
All right. Okay. Yeah, some of the. Yeah, you're going to
Anyway,
and stuff, right?
As an economist, you know, normally economists give 1.5 hour seminars and natural scientists 50 minutes. So we got to talk economics. We got to talk longer.
Oh, okay. All right. Fair enough. All right. Eric, are you?
I have to speak in English, I suppose.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, just Paul, I just have one single question. Is there any perspective of hope somewhere? I mean, aside of voting for Bernie Sanders, something like hope somewhere, or what we could do, or is there any solutions?
I'm sorry, I keep forgetting I'm going to be translated. I have personal hope. I think the problem, first of all, we don't need any more research on the natural science side. We know more than enough of what's happening to know what directions we should be moving while we try and learn more about it. One of the reasons I've spent most of my last 30 years with economists, sociologists, psychologists, and so on is I think the really tough problems are in what we think of as the social sciences, on the cultural side, and so on. And one of the things we know from that is that when the time is ripe, a system can change very dramatically and very rapidly and faster than you ever expected. In my own life, if you had told me, if I'd been an adult in 1938, blacks were being lynched in the south of the United States, you could send a postcard through the mail with a picture of a black body on it, and it was considered perfectly okay, and so on. Now, if you had told me that there were going to be TV shows that only had blacks on them, and they weren't black TV shows, that people, there's been a fantastic change in that area, not far enough, but a change that was totally unexpected by, I think, everybody. Same thing, the Second World War changed the status of women dramatically. I'm a pilot. I took my instrument training from a woman. Now, you're undoubtedly, of all of you, have probably flown on an airliner where the captain was a woman. Again, we haven't gone far enough in getting rid of gender bias, but we've come so far in that period that, to me, it's a miraculous change, virtually. And for something that many of you will remember, I associate over time with a lot of people who at least think of themselves as incredibly politically sophisticated and up to date, and I sometimes probably think that way myself. Who among your friends or knowledgeable colleagues expected the Soviet Union to collapse in 1989? I mean, it went, and interestingly, if you looked at the details, it wasn't a global move. It somehow, the time had gotten ripe, and a whole series of countries did it, and in very different ways. There was violence in one case, and so I'm hopeful that if we talk to enough people, if the pan-Swiss think tank people and so on can get the job done, that when the time comes, we'll actually see a very rapid revolution, and people will be more prepared for it and make better decisions in the case. But it's, I must say, as I watch Donald Trump march towards the White House, I can't be totally optimistic.
Thank you very much.
Guido?
Yes. Well, I had the same question, because when I listen to you and I read your text, it is impressive and depressing at the same time. Impressive because you're really able to summarize the state of the arts since the 60s in a way that it's hardly possible to reject any of your arguments. But at the same time, you tend to use the language of the apocalypse. You use the four horsemen, and you speak of the endarkenment as the opposite of the enlightenment. And I'm also wondering, so how can we solve this? Because all behaviors show in the wrong direction, obviously, as you highlighted today. Isn't it the case that for at least 40 years, scientists believe that if they just show enough facts, people will change behavior? And then they feel almost insulted by the fact that people don't react to evidence.
Let me say, there's a lot of debate, and I come down in different places on how apocalyptic. This is the issue that Jim Hansen raised. You know, how much do you tell of the truth as you view it? How much do you soften it to give people hope? I can give you some empirical evidence on that particular question. Namely, after Ad and I wrote The Population Bomb, we got a fair amount of criticism for being too apocalyptic. You're scaring people. That doesn't work. People want solutions. Well, The Population Bomb sold roughly 2 million copies. And the 4 or 5 books we wrote subsequently on solutions sold altogether maybe 30 copies. In other words, there's a lot of stuff that's brooded around, which just turns out to be BS. Is BS translatable into French?
Bullshit?
Bullshit, yeah, or mierda. No, mierda. I'm sorry, my Spanish intrudes. But let's see, the second part of your question was more interesting.
No, the question of hope is how do you get this message through? And still,
perfect.
I believe
the
endarkment language is maybe not the best vision of the future.
What you said is totally correct. I had a little battle with Al Gore, who's an old friend. You know, Al Gore is the one who did the movie on climate change and so on. And he had me at a meeting, and he said, our meeting is to try and find ways to get the scientific information to the public more rapidly. And I said, Al, it doesn't matter how fast you get it to them. We have proven that giving people the scientific, I mean, we still, something like 40% of Americans don't think that there's evolution going on. And that's been since 1859. So that when we have to change the world in another decade or so, we're not going to do it by giving the scientific facts to people. You've got to have narratives, you've got to have art, and in fact, that's one of the things the Pan-Swiss group is doing and other groups. The Mob, for instance, we have a whole program in science art. And if you wonder what art can do, the best example I know is the picture of Earth from outer space when it first appeared. That did more for the environmental movement than any 20 books, convinced people that have an entirely different view of the planet. So I think narratives, art, different language, And you got to keep trying different things. I've been wrong repeatedly, and I'm sure I will be in the future, particularly on that topic, how people will behave under some circumstances.
But that means that scientists so far failed as storytellers. As storytellers.
Yeah, scientists have failed as storytellers. My life is a life of failure. I mean, none of the things that I have cared about, be they civil rights or what's happening to the environment or how the government runs and so on, everything has run, with the few exceptions that I gave, really, in the wrong direction. But we have changed. Again, my first girlfriend, when I was 8, could have been a teacher, she could have been a nurse, or she could have been a secretary, and that was it. And again, women don't get equal pay anywhere and so on, but they sure do a hell of a lot more than that today and are expected to. So people will change their behavior, but how to predict it?
Ehrlich, you want to follow up on something?
No, I was thinking about something. It's just you talk about the capitalist system, which is not really great. I agree with you. The problem of military system, the problem of, for example, agriculture and so on. There are all kinds of problems. But there is something you don't speak about, the weight of religion. What about religion?
You see, there's somebody who knows how to ask nasty questions. He said about the weight of religion.
I know it's not. Yeah, no.
Well, on one hand, I have written and believe that if we're going to solve these problems, we need a quasi-religious transformation. That is the only way human beings have managed. We're a small group animal. You got to remember that evolutionarily, our present culture is very young. The average hunter-gatherer, and we were hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years, was in a group of 50 to 150 people maximum. If you look at people's Christmas lists today, or lists of close colleagues, it's the same, we call it the Dunbar number, 50 to 150. So I can't remember what question I'm answering. Well, give me the last line of it.
Yeah, the weight of religion, in fact. The weight, really, the power of religion, in fact.
Oh, yeah.
Probably.
I think religion is like a lot of other technologies. Namely, it depends on how you use it. There are some very conservative religious groups that are really all out to protect the environment because they're protecting the creation. There's also a lot of people, for instance, ask me questions saying, isn't the problem the Catholic Church? If you look at the statistics, the countries in Europe, for example, that have the lowest birth rates are Catholic. And you look in the United States at who uses abortion more. Catholics do more than non-Catholics. So there's really Catholics perform just like non-Catholics in similar economic circumstances. It's the hierarchy that scares the politicians and that is, after all, trying to maintain a position of power. It's a big organization. And I think their positions are utterly, completely, and totally unethical. That is, if you look at what happens under abortion law, first of all, if you're against killing fetuses, you should be promoting contraception. We know statistically that if you ban abortion, all you do is kill women, basically, by driving them to quack abortion. So religion can be really good or really bad. My own view is believing that I've actually published, if you think that a supernatural monster created a universe with 300 sextillion stars, that is more stars than there are grains of sand on the beaches of Earth. The supernatural monster did that and yet retains a deep interest in your personal sex life. You shouldn't be in this audience.
Okay, thank you. I am going to ask you something because we do need to do some economics.
Okay.
So, but mixed up with sociological issues. You talked about the iPad equation. I was teaching that to my students at the business school just a few hours ago, so that now they see
the actual victim
who committed this equation. Okay, and in that framework, you talked about the Fred Pierce fallacy. and you said, well, that, you know, it's not a question, or Pierce says, it's not a question of too much population, but it's a question of too much consumption. And you said that's kind of idiotic, if I understand.
Imbecilic would be more accurate.
Imbecilic, okay, right. Oh, well, yeah, thanks for that. But what about the idea that, you know, if we did lower the per capita consumption in the West, which is already reducing its the population is already dropping, and if the per capita consumption in the poorer countries rose, which we know would probably decrease population endogenously there as well, that's not a, doesn't that make sense though?
What makes sense?
The connection between consumption and
they're mated. You can't separate them. So
no.
You can separate which one you're going to change or which one is changing at what rate.
Right.
But the total impact is going to be how many people you have times their per capita consumption.
Well, sure. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's not rocket science.
It's not rocket science, but it means that...
It's not even economics.
But it means that the issue of, you know, the population bomb is, of course, linked to consumption practices worldwide. It can't be separated from those either. I think there Pierce is probably right, isn't he?
In what sense?
Well,
he's saying ignore population, okay,
yeah,
and concentrate on the important thing, which is consumption.
Right.
So if you ignore population, okay, and between now and 2100, you reduce everybody's consumption by a third.
Right.
The problem will be just as big, even bigger than it is now, particularly because we're burning human beings. One of the worst things about human beings is we're smart, and economists know this very well. That you pick the low-hanging fruit first, so that the same combination of total consumption today is going to be cheaper in terms of the environmental impact than it will be at the end of the century.
Okay, but that to me is mostly a question of how we, the rich, prosperous nations, keep over-consuming.
Oh, do not for a minute think, Ann and I have written articles called Too Many Rich Folks.
Right.
There's no question, and that was the basic idea of writing the IPAD equation.
Okay.
Yeah.
But let me just bring you to another sort of different issue before we hand it over to the audience. What about, I'm going to try to formulate this briefly, it's a bit complex, but what about, let's call it racialization. Let me explain what I mean here. Isn't there the risk that using or misusing your approach, Western rich discourses, you know, of differentiation are going to be trying to identify the too fertile humans as those that are not, you know, not one of us? Or how do we, you know, unite the issue of per person consumption and the issue of the number of bad persons?
The bad persons are ones with different skin colors, among other things.
Aren't they?
I will be happy to send you a copy of a book called The Race Bomb. Ann and I have written all kinds of stuff. And I can tell you this because this is my specialty. I am trained originally as an evolutionist and a geneticist. There is not the slightest shred of evidence to indicate that people of different races, however you define them, have any set of genetically controlled characteristics.
Sure, but, yes, but the approach you're suggesting, which I don't doubt that it's the way you're putting it, aren't you worried at how quickly it can be misused as a vested defense of the status quo and of all kinds of things? I mean, that's what I think worries a lot of people.
It worried us enough so that we wrote books about it. In other words,
but they sold 30 copies.
That, you know, when you're dealing with the race issue, it's one of the toughest ones to deal with public because almost everybody comes with their mind already made up. So if you want to tell them what actually the real story is on evolution of human beings and so on, you come to a set of people who already have their embedded prejudices. The first thing you got to do is try and convince them that what they've thought since they were kids is dead wrong. But I'll ask you the question. If you believe, as for instance, all the scientists at this conference, this one and one I just had at Vancouver, believe that there's a very substantial chance that if we don't change our course, that society will collapse and most people, everybody's lifestyle will disappear and most of the people will disappear. Then the issue is, what kind of chance do you run of whether somebody will come in and say, take a racial, I mean, we're in a racist society. You can't do anything in the United States that hasn't got a racial, social thing in it. And the issue is, do you then ignore all the other problems? And it's a tough one. I mean, it's an ethical thing. How do you choose?
Yes, sure. Yes. Thank you. Okay, we've blabbered on enough. I think we would now like to hand it over to our audience, members of the audience. I'm supposed to be distributing the time and speech, but I sort of partially see the audience only, so it's going to be a bit tough. Maybe I'll let the
Can we get the lights up?
The microphone.
Right. Yes, right.
Oh, okay.
That's
yes,
perfect.
thank
That's
you.
much
Thank
better.
you. Okay,
Yeah.
please, sir. Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Okay, I think
My name,
No, please. There's already somebody there. Thank you.
my name is Alec Gagneux, and I have a question regarding the economic development and the relation to the population growth. The Sustainable Development Goals, which just got issued recently, want to improve the quality of our planet Earth, but the point 8 of these goals wants infinite growth. And this is a scandal, I think, and that the whole world says we should go that path finally destroys the whole planet. Now my question is, do you see any relationship between the compulsion to economic growth, to GDP growth, and the laissez-faire, that means not intervening and not giving the people access to family planning, to voluntary family planning? Do you see any relation from economic growth compulsion to family planning, which is not really improved in the poor countries?
Well, I guess one of the points is, of course, that if you do give contraceptive information, if you do have family planning, it tends to add to development in general. That is, when you have family planning programs in place, education levels go up and so on. But the basic issue, I'm afraid, is as long as we have governments as we have them today, that people have to recognize, A, that the number of people in a country is a matter for government. You have to have, if you want to have people having a decent life, it isn't an issue of how many children individuals want. It's an issue of what kind of life can those children live, and it's up to the society as a whole to try and determine that. The idea that you can grow forever and that one of the problems is we make up human rights. Let's invent some rights. My right that I'm going to invent for myself is that the rest of the supply of the 45 moutons will become my property. That's my individual human right. The idea that everybody has a right to have as many children as they want is simply wrong. It's like saying everybody has a right to rob the bank, or everybody has a right to throw their garbage in their neighbor's yard or something. Your rights end where they tread on other people's rights, and you ought to be very careful about which ones you invent. Remember, all the human rights were invented by human beings, usually ones who were in power and want to have rights that would favor them rather than rights that would favor the poor people, for example.
There was a question back there.
Hello, my name is Stefan Metzler. I studied over here at EPFL, Physics and IT, and I think it's high time that there is a little contradiction here. You actually have a famous professor at Stanford, a colleague of yours, Thomas Sowell, whom I greatly appreciate, and he's a follower of a man who made the prediction that the Soviet Union would actually collapse. In 1922, in his book Socialism, he predicted the exact way the Soviet Union would go, including the terror, and the economic collapse, and then followed by the system collapse. So he already knew that would happen because he knew how people function, how the markets function, And he totally, thoroughly disagrees with your point of view that this has to be dictated from above, because this is exactly why the Soviet Union collapsed. In fact, the best way to have economic development is freedom, economic individual liberty, and no one must tell people how many kids they should have, because once they're free, they will actually have few kids, because they will enjoy life, and they will want to offer those kids good conditions. We see it here in Switzerland. People actually now start having like 1, 2 kids by the time they're 35, 40. We suddenly have a baby boom that was unexpected, because suddenly people before didn't have kids, now they decide to have kids, as it fits into their life plan. Now in poor countries, they use kids as insurance. So they make lots and lots and lots of kids because they have socialist systems, they have governance that is absolutely horrifying, that is totally corrupt, that we have here at the UN, and who make the famous laws and dictators and stuff. And in fact, people who agree with you, like at the UN for the climate IPCC chair, think that the best system to manage climate would be communism, as in China. That is complete utter nonsense. In fact, I have to strongly disagree on the climate issue. It is not set. It's a very, very complex issue, and there is top-level climatologists who think that the human influence is approximately 2% on the climate. And anyone who says that this is a settled issue simply doesn't know the science. There is so much going on, and all the predictions so far have been completely wrong, especially your own predictions. I cannot remember a single prediction that you ever made that ever came true. The Economist, for example, has proven that not only did the population increase massively, but the poor people now do much better than they did in the 1960s, although their numbers have grown so much. So the poor are living better than back then. So that is already one thing. And as the poor live better, their population growth will diminish.
Sir, please, would you come to your question, please? Thank you.
Yes, so the whole point
very
is,
short.
how can you continue to pretend that systems that have utterly failed, that keep failing, will be the solution?
Okay.
Governance is not the solution.
Okay, thank you.
Liberty.
Thank you, thank you.
I disagree.
Well,
how does one summarize 60 years of intensive study dealing with the very best people in the world, none of whom liked the Soviet Union or the Soviet system, into a reply to that? In other words, the idea that, first of all, what I'm saying about climate is the opinion of not the IPCC, but a whole series of very close people I've worked with for years who know it intensively, know all the math. B, we're seeing the effects right now. In other words, empirically, for example, one of the predictions is that extreme weather will become more common. Extreme weather is becoming more common. You don't even have to predict about sea level rise. That's basic physics. Unless Isaac Newton and all his buddies over time were dead wrong, and Sowell, who's a not too stupid far-right person in the Hoover Tower, must have discovered something in physics that no physicist knows. So what am I supposed to say? The neocons have done a great job of fixing up the world. We have more inequity in the United States now than we've ever had before. The world is retreating in terms of equity across the board. And there's no sign at all that the market, uncontrolled, can deal with things like externalities. The market is a wonderful thing. You got to remember that even the great hero of the market, and that was in
Adam Smith?
What? Smith, yeah, Adam Smith. Everybody says, Adam Smith says uncontrolled markets will run the world. Adam Smith wrote an entire book before the Wealth of Nations called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, in which he said what kind of world and how it had to be organized for the market to work reasonably. That's something probably Sowell never heard of.
Thank you. Sir, yes?
One important experiment in population control was the one-child policy in China, which is now coming to an end. And I was wondering if you could just comment on that experience.
It's like a lot of other things, complicated. I actually know the person who founded it, and one of my colleagues has worked very hard with them to overcome one of the difficulties that it created. Namely, because they already had ultrasound, it led to a huge number, disproportionate abortion of female fetuses because of the great interest that the Chinese have in having men. And so there are areas of China where there is a huge disproportion in the number of young men and young women. My colleague Mark Feldman has been involved with them on a program called Valuing Girls, where they have gone to try and change the overall attitude. Some people estimate that it prevented the birth of maybe 350 million people. Other people say that the trend was already economically, as the last speaker said, total fertility rates tend to go down as you develop. What people like Seoul miss is there are limits to how far you can develop. We're already, by the best ecological estimates, 1.5 times bigger operation on the planet than can be sustained. In other words, if we were going to have a sustainable population living with many people in misery, but I mean with today's distribution, you'd need about 1.5 Earths. If everybody going to live like a Swiss, you'd need about 5 Earths. I'll be much more happy listening to the souls of the world when they tell us where we're going to get the other 5 Earths.
Thank you. Sir? Oh. Okay.
My name is Luca Bertagnolio. Professor Ehrlich, you mentioned James Hansen a couple of times, and I've happened to read of the things he's done through the years, but lately James Hansen has slightly changed his position vis-a-vis generation of energy, electricity in particular, as he has moved towards a more pro-nuclear view in generation of electricity, of energy in general. Of course, this is very much related to his views on climate change, the fact that nuclear energy happens to be basically CO2 free vis-a-vis other forms of carbon-based electricity. I was wondering if you could give us your view on what are we doing good and bad on energy generation in this planet today.
You have a really interesting group here who knows how to ask the nasty questions.
Don't we?
My view on nuclear is not, I mean, obviously I've looked at it a lot, but it's based on the opinion of people like John Holdren, who's now the Obama's science advisor and so on, who spent their life looking at it. And there are several points that can be made. One is it's not totally carbon-free, but it's a lot closer than a lot of the others. Most people that I know think it should be kept in the mix. It has got numerous advantages. It has some big disadvantages. For example, it would not go in the United States if it had to pay its own insurance. It's insured by the public only. And there's huge various problems that can range from catastrophic accident to weapons or at least dirty bomb connections and so on. But I think that going back to what I said in the other thing, there's some chances you have to take. I probably would be in favor of going nuclear if I was absolutely certain that we would not do any of the things we need to do to reduce the carbon footprint from other sources. But again, nuclear only gives you electricity, and that makes things tricky for things like flying. So it's a very complex issue, and I don't have any strong thing. I don't automatically think nuclear is bad. I think it could be made good, but we've had real problems in management, insurance, and in design. After all, we made a big mistake. The scientific community, in a sense, made a big mistake by saying that nuclear weapons were not the thing that nuclear power plants would give us energy too cheap to meter, which of course it hasn't, and solve all our problems. And as Holdren has pointed out, our problem with energy isn't too little, too late. It's too much, too soon. You could destroy the world with bulldozers run on electricity. So you got to be really careful about the end uses on energy. You got to look at all the factors. There are huge social and economic factors tied into it. And I think it's a mistake just to say any one technology is unacceptable. What we did with nuclear was decided to use them in reactors in military use, and that was in nuclear submarines. Submarines have to be as small as possible for their mission so they won't be detectable. So they made very high energy density reactors, stuck them in submarines, where they've been quite successful doing that, but then they went and scaled up those reactors to the civilian use. You could design reactors, if I understand it properly, it would be much, much safer than the designs we had that we deployed originally that gave us some accidents and very bad PR on nuclear. So my position is, I don't know enough about it, but we ought to be carefully considering all the energy options while we get rid of fossil fuels as much as we can. I don't think there's any disagreement in the scientific community that we have to dramatically reduce our use of fossil fuels.
Okay, thank you, sir. I suggest we have 3 more questions, and then we see if there's any energy.
If I have any voice left.
Energy left in your reactor. Okay.
Professor Ehrlich, tremendous honor to be here tonight. Thank you. My name is Daniel Yost. My question is also regarding the United Nations global goals. And if you had the chance to give a speech in front of the United Nations here in Geneva, what would you tell them in terms of their successes or failures with universal family planning and this issue?
Well, on the family planning issue, I would say they pay much too much attention, like US politicians, to particularly the political power of the Catholic hierarchy. Again, not the Catholic people who I think suffer from that. And a lot of them, I mean, that's part of the attitude. In the United States, there are a lot of Catholics who have actually formed organizations saying, you know, we got to get off of this stuff. And the current Pope has shown signs of understanding that. He gave a talk in which he pointed out that the church shouldn't be so deeply interested in what are basically personal issues. And so I would say something about that to the UN. I'm not, like most Americans, an enemy of the UN. It's the organization we have now. We can improve it. Most Americans don't know all the very good things that the UN does that don't make the headlines, that are really helpful in lots and lots of places. But again, it goes back to the issue, which I can't even remember if I mentioned it earlier, of we got to design a global governance system that, I'll give you a little longer harangue. The US faced this issue in about 1783, I think it was. There were 13 separate states that had been colonies of Great Britain that didn't necessarily like each other, that had sometimes had different religions, that got together and figured out that there were issues they had to deal with jointly, like foreign affairs, trade, and so on. And they struggled to create a constitution, which they did, which has functioned reasonably well, less so recently over time. But they actually, you know, said, we have this gigantic problem, we have a governance problem, we want to figure out how to do it. The world ought to be doing that now to try and get a governance system that both lets you deal with the big problems, but also lets you remain free at the level of your own nation. So there are many things in Switzerland. After all, you think I'm here for a scientific meeting. I'm here for the chocolate. I don't want to see the world. I don't want to see Swiss chocolate molded with Costa Rican chocolate, because Costa Rican chocolate's really lousy. But there are some things that Switzerland and Costa Rica have to work together on, like climate change. And we need a system where you can do that. That's probably too long an answer, but what the hell.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad that you are bringing up the global governance issue, because you're basically answering the question I'm about to make, which is, I thought that the previous questioner, with his comment, was a good display of how climate change denial really isn't about the science at all. It's about ideology and neoliberalism as a kind of religion, where it's not facts or evidence or empirical evidence that really have anything to do with it. And so it seems to me like the problem for climate change deniers is that the solutions are all about governance and regulation and perhaps even some kind of global supranational regulation, and that seems to scare a lot of people. But what you just said suggests that that's the solution that you see. Is that really likely to happen? Are there steps being taken in that direction? There seems to be so much terror of that.
I don't know if it's likely to happen. My instincts are it's not. But you see crazy things in the political system now, that the ideology of the no government, the goal of the Republican Party has been explicit to remove as much government as possible and then drown the rest of it, get rid of it. Now, it's just like we have the Tea Party in the United States, which thinks that it's which is anti-tax. That's its goal. Get rid of the taxes. The interesting thing is the people in it are so stupid that they named it after the Boston Tea Party, thinking that was a protest against taxes, which it wasn't. It was a protest against Parliament being able to tax people in the United States. They were quite willing to have taxes levied by their colonial governments. And this is, you got to ask yourself, if these people were smart enough, why the hell do we have governance? Why do we have taxes? What are they for? Why did we go down that route? And obviously the reason you have governments is there are some things we all want done that you can't do alone. I can't defend myself from a war, on and on. Same thing with taxes. They want their potholes filled, but they don't want to pay taxes. So one of the things that's happened is our educational system has really failed on a lot of these fronts. In the United States, I can't say anything at all about Switzerland. But the very fundamental things about why we have government, what taxes are for, how the environment works, and so on, doesn't mean you can't have disagreements, but they have no idea of the basics, like Sowell. Doesn't know anything at all, as far as I can tell, about how the biophysical world works, even though he lives in it. And then he can come up with all this crap. And this is standard. And you listen to it all the time, and it gets boring.
Thank you. Sir?
So hello, my name is Oscar Morand, studying natural sciences at the University of Neuchâtel. Being part of the younger generation here, before my questions, I just wanted to say that it's very exciting just to be alive in this time. There was the question of hope, and I don't find it depressing. I'll need all my creativity to find solution now, and I'm very happy just for that. Now, here's my question, studying natural sciences. You say that enough studies have been done in natural sciences. I agree. I'm sometimes wondering, why am I at the university? So my question is, what do you think is the role of the university in the future challenge, specifically about ethics? Thanks.
Well, I'd like to think that universities should have the job of, a major job of dealing with the problems that a society faces at any given time. They're like most human institutions. They have a characteristic which is basically usually good. They're conservative. And conservatism is, I think, a very important principle, and as Edmund Burke and others thought about it, you're conservative if you decide that you don't change every time something comes along until you're pretty damn convinced that the new way will be at least as good or better than the old way. And I think that's something universities ought to do, but they also ought to be at the front line of intellectual activity. It's not, by the way, when I say we don't need more scientific research to know what direction to go in, it doesn't mean that a lot of scientific research won't be more helpful, for instance, in designing energy systems. But we already know that we got to get rid of the fossil fuels. There's not going to be, the odds of something coming out that will make that different are so small that we needn't worry about it. But I still do standard population biology with insects. I do it because I enjoy it. I like learning about the world. That's my time off, basically. And I think that's true of most people in universities. I'm not saying stop doing what you're doing and only do something that will help you save the world today. Put some of your time into that, but also put some of your time into learning how the world works in ways that might be very useful in the future.
So, Professor Ehrlich, do you have any energy left in the reactor for one more question?
I can take one more question.
One more.
I'll try. Does everybody know American Sign Language if my voice disappears? Oh,
okay, one last question. Yes, I'm sorry. I apologize to people who are obviously.
Thank you very much. I applaud this discussion. I think it's very thought-provoking, and it's also showing that indeed we are a quarrelsome species, as a famous author wrote. But we are also capable of entertaining pluralism, like we are doing it in this room. So to your point of governance, I guess it's not about top-down, how we can get better at top-down governance, but how we can foster the kind of pluralism that I believe has taken Switzerland from a group of quarrelsome tribes to a very successful nation. So the question to you, do you see any ways we can change the governance debate to not so much what's the role of the state, but how can we foster this pluralism that allows us to finally agree and find some consensus?
That in part is what the mob was founded to do, to get civil society not just doing the things that are mostly good, but to reduce much of civil society, NGOs and so on, are involved in competing for finding funds and so on. And we wanted to get some common themes so that, for example, the issue of global governance, if every NGO, even if they're interested in better housing for the poor or interested in animal rights or something else, always said, but we want our problem to be solved in a world that has reasonable governance and can protect us from, for example, if you're interested in animal rights, or take those two examples, better housing for the poor. You get a 6 degrees Celsius raise in the temperature, they all become moot. Not going to work. And so if more and more people in society understood what the really fundamental questions were and put some of their time into it, then I think we'd have a better world and learn to like each other better too, because there's nothing like working with people to get rid of some of the quarrels.
Well, thank you so much for your wonderful stamina and availability. We're very grateful to have you here, and we will have to leave it at that. I'm so sorry for people who want to ask more questions. We could go on for... So we're going to do a break now and be back in 15 minutes for the other 5 hours.
Yeah, right.
Okay, thank you very much.
It's great to meet you. It's great to meet you.